The fishery is obviously of concern to your community and to the people at your community learning center. It's also a concern to Dr. Stanley Nowak, who is an associate professor of geography at Memorial University. Actually, he's an economic oceanographer, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Now, the fishery is a problem. There are a number of problems within the fisheries. Could we perhaps define them at the beginning? Do you think there is a problem with the fishery?
Well, I think there is undoubtedly a considerable problem with the fishery. There is a problem now of greatly declining stocks. There is a problem now of blatant overfishing. There is a problem of competition from foreign fisheries effort. And there are internal problems like marketing structures and equally financing problems within the industrial structure as such within Newfoundland and even in Labrador.
That's an incredible array of problems, and a lot of people feel fairly pessimistic about them. A lot of people feel there's nothing that can really be done. How do you feel about it?
Well, I was trained that in science there is no such thing as it cannot be done. It's a matter of opportunity, finance, knowledge, etc. Certainly, I don't see the problem of the fishery as insurmountable. Perhaps we could overcome the problem to some extent by devising a policy, a fisheries policy towards conservation and management. Now, I came to Newfoundland 4 years ago, and pretty soon after arriving I made a program for Theo-Logica in which I state there is no fishery policy in this province. And I'm very sorry to hear that some 4 years later I'm still making this statement. However, let me qualify what I have just said a little bit further. It is not strictly true to say there has been no policy within the fisheries. There is, for instance, a document once issued by Premier Smallwood called a policy on the fisheries provided by the government of Newfoundland and Central Government of Ottawa. That does exist. Furthermore, somewhere in the Premier's precincts within Confederation Building, there are voluminous reports produced by the Premier Steering Committee on the Fisheries. But these have not yet been made public. Now, they may contain the elements, the grain of a future policy when they are properly assessed. Thirdly, the Harris report does mention certain excellent ideas which could be made into a fisheries policy. And subsequently, many political parties have gone on record as favoring a fisheries policy. I know that Mr. Roberts has a fishery policy, and even Mr. Panting, Dr. Panting, has a fisheries policy within the NDP party. Now, having said this, let me then go further and say that many of them perhaps are not true policies. They are statements of intent. They are overviews, they are plans of actions. They are not what I consider to be a policy. Of course, all these people say, well, we want to conserve the stock and we want to improve the fisheries, we want to maintain numerical abundance of fish, we want to maintain the communities. But they don't come up with a detailed month-by-month or year-by-year plan. A type of policy I have in mind would be a 5-year plan or a 10 or a 15-year plan where the various problems are given priorities within a certain rating. They are tackled off one by one, and as each problem is solved, a new problem is solved until a situation is produced whereby the problems are under control, and then a management system is brought in to keep them like that. In other words, once the fishery has been revitalized through a 15-year-old management and conservation plan, what is then needed is a second policy to keep it vital and never to allow it to drop down again.
All right, a lot of people who are fishing right now know that the stocks are down. Last year I was in Placentia Bay and they were coming in with just a few fish, maybe mackerel or something like that, in the bottom of the boat. Hardly anything. What can be done about that? They still go out fishing and they know there's nothing there.
Well, because the fishery has been so badly decimated in recent years, many fish have been so badly, well, I won't use the word destroyed, but the stocks have been so badly decimated that they are almost uneconomical now, that the situation is one approaching one of economic extinction. Now, I don't think the mackerel is anywhere near a situation of economic extinction. But the haddock certainly is, and in some areas the cod is beginning to be so, and some flatfish in some areas of Newfoundland are beginning to face a situation of economic extinction. Now that means that the fish are still around in the water. There is no biological extinction, but there are so few of them that it's just not worthwhile to fish them, you see. In other words, the fishermen go away before the fish go away. That's the classical statement. Towards that end, you need precisely such a 15-year management and conservation plan that I have just indicated. It's very much lacking. Would you be interested in what I had in mind?
Very much so,
On
yes.
such an issue. Well, of course, you could devise several management plans, and by no means am I saying that the one I am postulating is the best or even one of the better ones. But it is a plan, and no one else seems to be coming up with an alternative. I, for instance, believe that you should have a 15 years management and conservation plan within the province and indeed within the Maritimes. First of all, studies should be made to assess the stocks of each species of fish within Newfoundland. Let's devote 2 years to finding out exactly what the stocks are, what the stocks can support in every major species, how much mackerel is there left, how much cod is there left, how much herring is there left, and etc. through the entire list. That we know exactly what the stocks are and how much fishing they can withstand and support. Not merely now, but with a projection built in for 2 or 3 years later. So when we know the stock, say 2 years after the inception of the plan, we will also know what the position will be 4 years after the inception of the plan, in other words 2 years projected ahead. Well, having done this, we must then establish where each species is on the maximum and optimum sustainable yield curves.
What do you mean by that?
Now, that is an economic device to tell the scientist whether a certain species is underfished, overfished, or fished to full capacity, to full potential. The species that are underfished are low down on the curve, and those that are fished right just near the top, somewhat below the top, and then on the other side of the curve, it's a curve like this, you see. On the other side are other stocks that have been overfished. Now, we don't exactly know at the moment in Newfoundland where each species is. We can guess. I have some rough idea. I have statistics that might indicate plus or minus 20% error, but that's not good enough, you see. I want to know exactly. So I will then devote the next 2 years to finding out exactly where each species is on that curve. And again with a 2-year projection. That's 4 years. Having done that, you see, the next phase would then be to ascertain how to step up the fishery for the species that are underfished. So the fishermen are getting more return from the underutilized species. Mm-hmm. At the same time, how to phase down the fishery for the species that are overfished, that we not decimate the species any further.
For example, cod?
Cod, and for example, haddock, and some flatfish, and even lobster, and crab maybe in some areas, you see. So that would be the next phase. And again, 2 years are needed to ascertain ways of upgrading some fisheries and downplaying other fisheries. Now, that's 6 years. 2 years later, or for the next 2 years, again, teams of scientists should be working to ascertain how the species that are on the wrong side of the curve, in other words, they are overfished, could be brought to the right side of the curve. In other words, how to resuscitate the dormant and defunct fisheries and to make them viable once more.
How you would get more codfish, how you
get more
the
codfish,
stocks.
how you prevent the codfish being overfished further, but at the same time to get more of it into the system, you see, to the ecosystem. And that would take 2 years just to find out the best ways of doing this, you see, to ascertain the correct procedure for this kind of an exercise, indeed for this kind of policy. And then once you had the knowledge on how to do this, the next 2 years should be spent in doing it. In other words, making experiment inputs designed at resuscitating the dormant and extinct fisheries. And then, once all the species were on the right side of the curve, and each fish species was correctly utilized, the next few years could be spent studying ways of keeping it like that. In other words, managing the stocks. assuming that we have saved the stocks from depletion, let's prevent this happening again. Let's not deplete them any further in the future. So let's find out the best ways of keeping them non-depleted, keeping them on the point of optimum sustainable yield. Not maximum sustainable yield, because one must allow some 10-12% for biological fluctuations, which are inevitable in the environment.
Right.
And of course that would mean studies on legal aspects, on controls, on bylaws, on close seasons, on types of gear, on types of mesh, or on the desirability of things like gillnet, or I'm not saying they're not desirable, I'm saying we should find out, you see, whether they are, you see. And so on. And then the last few years should be spent on ways of maintaining this thing forever, you see. So once we have revitalized the fishery, brought them to a point where they are back to 1930 levels, not 1920 levels, well, it's renewable resource. Once we had the proper management policy, we can keep like that for 1,000 years or more. It pleases out.
How essential is it that you have control of the areas, the breeding grounds, say the continental shelf, or limits? Should there be limits should there be limits imposed, like offshore limits?
Well, certainly, you see, in any property, whether it's agriculture or fisheries or forestry, you are not going to get much success unless you own the property you are developing, because somebody will come along and say, well, okay, so you've done all this work and you've invested all this money, I'm going to benefit, I'm going to cut down your trees, or I'm going to plow up your fields, you see. So you must have legal protection. But I don't personally wish to go on record, at this point anyway, on what form this legal protection should take place. The reason being that we're not discussing the law of the sea here,
right.
And furthermore it's to some extent sub judice on an international level, because the Geneva conference isn't yet over. If you take my point. Right. Now, if you wish to develop this point further, let's say a few weeks from now, when I had time to study a document of Geneva, I'm willing to do this. You see.
Fine. Well, thank you very much for coming by and talking with us. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I would like to make a point here that I see aquaculture and fish farming as an indispensable input into this management policy.
Do you think the government or any governments are starting to see it that way, not necessarily this particular one?
Well, of course, I cannot speak for the government, but I do know that the federal government is extremely interested in fish farming. I do know that the provincial government is beginning to be interested in it, and I also am aware of the fact that there is excellent work being done in places like the Logan Bay Laboratory on aquaculture, in other laboratories like the one in New Brunswick, St. Andrews, New Brunswick, in Quebec City and elsewhere, and immensely valuable work is being done in Manitoba, near Erickson, on sweetwater pisciculture, which could have great relevance to the fisheries of Newfoundland. Indeed, I see aquaculture as an absolute sine qua non for the removal of the overfished species from a position of overfishing to a position of incipient fishery. In other words, the best way to transfer the overfished species to an underfished species is through massive inputs of agriculture.
Well, perhaps we could talk about that as a separate topic at another time then as well.
Most certainly.
Thank you very much for coming by.
It's a pleasure.